Hello, I am Claudia Chamas. I am a researcher and professor of Foundation Oswaldo Cruz. I work in the Center of Technological Development for Health, CDTS of Fiocruz, and I work for a long time with the subject of intellectual property and its relationship with public health, innovation, and also in the context of global health. This presentation is divided in some issues. Initially, we will speak briefly about the evolution of intellectual property in the world. And afterwards, we will speak about a connection between the correlation of the problem between health, innovation, and intellectual property nowadays. We will also talk about some specific subjects that are very important for the agenda of the public health managers, scholars, and all the other people concerned with this subject. The specific subjects are the crisis in productivity, in research and development in pharmaceutical area, the exclusivity of data of clinical trials, pharmaceutical patents and evergreening, strategic situation of evergreening, and the problem of the border protection measures and intellectual property, and finally, a special subject about the action of WHO, mainly the process that involves the issuance of Resolution 61.21 of the group CEWG and demonstration projects that are currently in course. We will start talking about the evolution of intellectual property. This intellectual property has a very long and complex history. So we'll see very briefly some of the main aspects that came to the situation that we have nowadays. With the approval of the triple agreement and bilateral agreements. Relationship between health and trade are very evident in several negotiation processes and deciding processes that affect issues about access to medication and to technology and health. In this context, in the last decades, we can observe there is intensification of the globalization economical process. This process brings with it, it's followed by internationalization of intellectual property with the proliferation of treaties that are multilateral and bilateral and plurilateral treaties. To understand a bit more this subject, although very briefly, we must consider some previous movements that came to the negotiation and approval of the first treaties in the field of intellectual property. In the history of the humanity, formalization of patent started in Venice Republic in 1474, and afterwards in England in 1623 by the Statute of the Monopolies. This process had continuity in the 18th century with the dissemination and the sophistication of the patent laws and the patent system, especially in France and the United States. Reminding you that at this time, there was a transition of a strongly based economy on agrarian economy and manual processes, and a transition to a mechanized economy. So we had the first industrial revolution. In the middle of the second half of the 19th century, there were great struggles and ideas regarding the confirmation of the patent system. So we had basically three great groups in this discussion. The first group, slightly small, defending the perpetual patent, going through groups that defended monopolies with specific periods, and other groups that also were quite strong, that were supporting the non-existence of patent monopoly because this would offend the free competitiveness and they would bring bad effects to entrepreneurs and inventors. So, in summary, the result of this debate was that the patent monopoly was the one that was succeeded and ended with approval in the Convention of Paris in 1893. The Convention of Paris started a process of harmonization in specific measures in the patent field. This has an effect, an environment of some restrictions for participating countries. What did we have before the Convention of Paris? The lack of an international treaty. So each country had full freedom to define their patent policies, their laws for patents, how they would act in this field. With the signature, the country belonging to the Paris Convention, naturally they were committing themselves with specific conditions that they should respect. So we passed from a total freedom environment to an environment with some restrictions. Naturally, there was a lot of freedom for this intellectual property system, especially in the Convention of Paris for the patent system. We have to highlight that in the pharmaceutical field, the patents were not compulsory. This gave freedom to each country to define, I want to concede for pharmaceutical patent or not. I want to allow the field for free competition. More than 50 countries decided not to concede pharmaceutical patents, including developed countries. This situation maintained itself until 1994, when we finalized the negotiation process around of GATT's negotiation. When in 1994, they finally created the WTO and a set of commercial agreements, among them the Appendix 1C, that is a triple agreement. This triple agreement states as compulsory the granting of pharmaceutical patents for products and pharmaceutical processes. So we left an environment of Paris Convention with some restrictions to an environment, to a situation of many more restrictions, not including the adaptation period that was expected for the developing and more poor countries. The intellectual property was linked definitely to a trade environment, to the commercial issues. Up to now, intellectual property, the agreement of the Convention of Paris, was under the administration of very technical body, the WIPO, with triple agreement. We went to another level of management, and management linked to commercial issues. Besides that, after the triple agreement, naturally, due to its new perspectives, considering the compliance of granting of patents for products and pharmaceutical processes, we had new debates and new ideas were given, and groups that traditionally didn't deal on this matter started to incorporate to this discussion, and then people in favor of public health systems, humanitarian groups, civil society, religious groups, defenders of generic industry, a great number of players that had importance and had voice and participation in this debate. We had a number problems of interpretation regarding this triple agreement, including the use of the flexibility of this treaty that culminated with the Declaration of Doha on Public Health and Intellectual Property in 2001. After the approval of the triple agreement in its process of internationalization and national laws, other negotiation processes started ongoing, especially related to bilateral relationships. So several bilateral agreements between the United States, Europe, and several other countries, included countries in development, were negotiated and signed, and some other ones are under negotiation up to today, besides bilateral and also plurilateral agreements, like the South Pacific one that is having a great debate nowadays. An important thing to enhance regarding these bilateral agreements of trade and investment are the clauses of intellectual property that are so-called TRIP Plus. TRIP Plus clauses involve commitments that go beyond what was agreed in the triple agreement, much more beyond what was agreed in the triple agreement. I have to also mention the involvement and participation in this process of WHO. WHO has a debate on the effects of the triple agreement in the access and local production, and the price of the drugs, and also WHO started having commissions and groups for studies and assemblies. These assemblies definitely had the subject relationships between health, innovation, and intellectual property. This started to become part of the permanent agenda of the WHO. Besides the bilateral and plurilateral agreements, we have the subject we'll see more ahead, the strategy of the shifting forum. I will explain this a little bit more after this presentation. Now we'll speak about 5 issues that are very important to understand which is the current agenda and which are the main problems that we have, especially for our region and for the set of countries that are in development. The first subject is regarding the so-called the productivity crisis of the pharmaceutical PhD. This crisis is very well mentioned not only in literature but also in many government reports, including reports from the North American government, like the Gao report, and a report of the White House where they describe this problem of the productivity crisis in the pharmaceutical industry. What happens is that we can observe that in the last 3 decades, there is a constant decline in the registration of new molecular entity in FDA, in the sanitary authority in the United States. In spite of the investments that are performed, productivity has been maintained very low, especially considering that in 1994, the triple agreement was approved, and very more robust systems of protection of patents were adopted practically in the whole world. And second, the defenders of these systems are essential. Their incentives, they're essential and related to the capability of innovation, the possibility of having stronger patents for a longer period, for example, 20 years. This would stimulate the industry to obtain much more innovation. However, the registry in the FDA hasn't shown this. Besides that, we have another problem: the low investment in diseases that exist in the developing countries. We have a lack of investment and also of approved drugs for this context of the poorer countries. And not only this, specific classes of drugs, for example, like antibiotics, lacked investment and lacked more research, more innovation. Besides that, with the number of patents regarding blockbusters that are reaching to the end, they have their period expiring, the industry has been mobilizing to replace and renew their strategies of presence in the market and try to maximize their return on their investments. The case of the drug sulfonylurea for hepatitis C is a case that illustrates and is very emblematic on this repositioning of their industry in this new context of expiry of patents regarding blockbusters and of the decline of the registry of new molecules. The second issue that we're going to talk about is the exclusivity of data regarding clinical trials. We have nowadays pressure in several developing countries to adopt a mechanism of granting exclusivity of data for this type of trials. Not all the countries grant this, but some of them grant this through clauses of commitment through bilateral agreements. In Triple's Article 39.3, it states very clearly that we must give protection against the commercial unlawful use of this data that is used for the approval of new drugs, of new molecules, the registry of new molecules. However, with the disclosure of the bilateral agreements and other strategies, we have had this dissemination of the tool of exclusivity for clinical trials. And this brings, naturally, a delay, a very strong delay for the introduction of generic drugs in a country that adopts this kind of procedure, which can bring a lot of problems in prices and in the capability of offering more effectiveness in the system of public health. The next subject relates to the strategy of evergreening related to pharmaceutical patents. This also has a correlation that is very strong with the decline of the productivity of pharmaceutical industry. In the last 2 or 3 decades, we can see a trend, inclusively already mentioned in the United States report, especially of the Gall report, of a trend of take advantage of well-known molecules that have been patented and have under public domain. So industry is trying to take advantage of new uses, for example, for these molecules and obtain new patents related to these uses or new doses and other protection strategies. There is also a constant pressure for legislation, several countries, especially developing countries, to adopt intellectual property clauses and have international legislation, specific protection for this type of invention. That also, like the exclusivity of data, can have as an effect the increase in prices of that product that is under the monopoly and the blockage of competitiveness for a specific molecule. Another strategy that has been adopted after the adoption of the Triple Agreement, the approval of the Triple Agreement, besides the bilateral and plurilateral agreements, is the so-called shifting forum strategy. This strategy regards the search that some countries have to find new forums to negotiate subjects of intellectual property. And these organizations, they're not traditional organizations that hold discussions for intellectual property, like the OMC and the Organization of International Property. So we have new players in this process, like the Customs Worldwide Organization and the Office of the United Nations for Drugs and Crimes. These processes are very complex, not only complex, of difficult following up by part of developing countries. What we're searching for in these organizations is the approval of guidelines similar to the ones that have been adopted by the European Union. We have to enhance a process that recently occurred about from 2006 to 2009, where we had its greatest point in 2006 to 2009, that was generic drugs that were legitimate in transit, especially from Indian origin towards developing countries like African countries, like Brazil and others. And they used to pass through ports and airports in Europe. And the customs in Europe of each country, the German and the Dutch customs, they used to retain the drugs under the allegation of a supposed violation of the rights of intellectual property. This process was very complex, and it involved discussions, including in the WTO, and the countries were paying a lot of attention to these attempts of avoiding a generic trade that is legitimate, and though no right of intellectual property was being violated in the transit from India, stopping at a European port or airport, and going to a developing country. So this process was supported by a European standard at the time, the 203 standard. We tried to adopt similar standards in other organizations. It's important to enhance that this subject is being debated also in some forums and assemblies of WHO. In the general assemblies in WHO, and it's important that the countries are very concentrated in order to adopt new proposals in this sense. So it's necessary to have a monitoring system, a surveillance system, an activity in order to react regarding this type of guidelines or standards that certainly damage a lot the access to drugs in countries that are poor. As I explained at the beginning of this presentation, I enhanced the role in WHO in the discussion debate our relationship between innovation, health, and intellectual property. This process started a little bit afterwards, basically in the year 2000. It started more importance, and especially with a specific commission of experts in 2003, a commission that was temporary but was very important, that investigated the basics of these relationships, the structure, the new structure, and the effects that the triple agreement was starting to impose to the developing countries, especially price, access, and local production, and the use of flexibility of the triple agreement. This commission that had in our region with Professor Carlos Correa among its members, it finalized in 2006 and issued a report. And one of the main recommendations of what resulted of this report was the creation of intergovernment group that worked during 2 years in WHO, and it was succeeded in the resolution 61.21 on the strategy and an action plan on public health, innovation, and intellectual property. This strategy that is disposal in the site of Internet, I recommend you all to read with a lot of attention. It deals with several issues: access, intellectual property, technology transference, funding, and coordination, research, and development. As of the adoption of the approval of this resolution by the member countries of WHO, we have a group of experts to deal with the funding for research and development of interest of the developing countries. This group worked, and in 2010, from 2010 to 2011, we have a new group of experts on this subject, on the funding subject, and coordination for research and development in the context that affects the developing countries. This group, called CWG, Consular Expert Working Group in Research and Development Financing and Coordination, it worked during 2 years and issued this report that is available in languages adopting the United Nations, including Spanish. I included the link here in this presentation. I recommend also that you read it with a lot of attention. There's an executive summary and a detail of all the context of the discussion of the group and their recommendations. As recommendation of this group, we propose some issues that we consider, and I say we consider because I had the honor and the opportunity of being part of this group. We dealt, for example, with the proposal of subjects like delinkage, that is, the delinkage of the cost of the production of the drug from its final price. And besides that, we proposed also an approach of open knowledge. The knowledge that is generated in the processes and the projects is open in order for other groups in developing countries may reproduce that research and that development, produce the drug in approach of sharing information and knowledge. Besides that, for example, we gave a great importance to the permits and licenses that are more appropriate to facilitate the access. This process had continuity. It was approved. Its continuity in the WHO Assembly, and it is ongoing nowadays. We selected some projects that are demonstration that will apply this concept, like the delinkage and the open knowledge approach. These processes are ongoing. There are difficulties, especially in the funding issue, but we hope we really do hope that these concepts that don't substitute the incentive mechanisms for patents, it's not proposed to do this. It's a way to add importance and incentivate research and develop of the interests of developing countries. So we hope that these concepts are disseminated and applied, and they don't remain only in the scope of this process of demonstrative processes. They can be applied in other processes and projects in the field of our region. Well, and to finalize, I would like to invite you all to study and deepen yourself in these subjects to understand better the consequences of each decision and each of these treaties, and in each of these decisions, and that the integration regional process will allow not only to study better the subjects, but to be enabled to have solutions that will be favorable to the increase to access to drugs and to technology, and basically to have drugs and vaccines and other health products more with better quality and price. I thank you very much for your attention, and I hope you profit a lot from the information. Thank you.